Welcome to CAST Pulse, the podcast from the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. This is episode 7. Food prices have moved sharply this year. The Consumer Price Index hit a 3-year high of 3.8% in April, driven in part by food costs. Grocery prices rose 0.7% that month, the largest single-month jump in nearly 4 years. USDA's Economic Research Service has nearly doubled its 2026 forecast for food-at-home prices, now projecting a 3.1% increase. A few things are converging at once. Tariffs are adding costs across the supply chain. Coffee's up nearly 20% over the past year, ground beef more than 15%. The conflict involving Iran pushed up fuel costs, with diesel and fertilizer reportedly up to 40% since it began. And drought across most of the lower 48 has left the US with its smallest cattle herd in 75 years, and record beef prices. To help make sense of all this, CAST is hosting a free live Meet the Expert conversation on July 7 at noon Central with David Ortega, food economist at Michigan State University and CAST's 2025 Borlaug CAST Communication Award recipient. It streams live on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Head to cast-science.org to add it to your calendar or grab the link. Today, we're getting a preview of that conversation. But a couple of things before we get to it. Nominations are open for the 2026 CAST Lifetime Achievement Award, CAST's award for career-long contributions to agricultural science, communication, and policy. Nominations close July 31st. And applications are open for the 2026 CAST Science Communication Scholarship, a $1,000 award for a student who can translate complex agricultural topics into clear, accurate messaging. Also due July 31st. Both will be presented at the CAST Award ceremony on December 10 at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Dr. David Ortega is a professor at Michigan State University, where he holds the Noel W. Stuckman Chair in Food Economics and Policy. He is CAST's 2025 Borlaug CAST Communication Award recipient, recognized for explaining agricultural economics to a general audience, something he has done in more than 400 media appearances, including the New York Times, NPR, the Wall Street Journal, and PBS NewsHour. We talked with him about what's driving food prices in 2026, tariffs, the conflict in the Middle East, drought, fuel costs, and how he approaches explaining all of that to people who are not economists. Here's that conversation. When a headline breaks about food prices, what are you looking at first? Supply costs, policy signals, something else?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is just to look at the economic data that we're getting. And some of the economic data comes from the government, other we get from industry. But the first thing is just let's look at what the economic data say. It could be costs. There's been a lot of focus on prices. But I think what's more important when we're communicating this or when I'm talking about this to the general public is what is driving those numbers. So looking at the story behind the numbers and also how that number, that story really connects to people's lived experience and what they are dealing with. Whether you're a farmer that's facing high fertilizer prices or a consumer going to the grocery store and unable to afford certain items because they've increased in price so much. So it's really looking at the economic data, what's driving that data, and also how it connects to people's lived experience. I think that's really important.
You are an academic, but you spend a lot of time explaining this stuff publicly. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, so it's not anything that I sort of planned. It kind of just, happened. But I can really just, if I were to pinpoint a period where this kind of took off, it was really during the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a lot that was going on. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was the health aspect of the pandemic that, I'm not qualified to speak about but when it came to the economics, the food system was really front and center. On the national news, there was a lot of conversations happening on social media about why the meat packing plants were closing, why there were shortages at the grocery store, and there was what I thought really a lack of factual grounded information that helped explain what was happening. And so I remember taking to social media at the time and just putting my thoughts out there, and really trying to make sense of the current situation, with the layer that there was a lot of uncertainty. A lot of us didn't really know how this was all going to play out, especially pretty early on in the pandemic. But there was really a need for grounded information. I saw the spread of misinformation at the time. I mean, this is something that's been happening for quite a bit of time. And so I thought it was important to sort of get ahead of that and provide the public and everyday people with information that could help explain what they were experiencing, and even more importantly, make much more informed decisions. And this is really different from the work that we do as academics, where we're looking at very specific questions, and we sort of narrow down on methods. And so here, that academic experience helps inform what I talk about, because it's grounded in theory, it's grounded in methods, it's grounded in data. But what it really comes down to is sort of making that connection with the public, a general audience, to help explain what they're experiencing, and also help them make more informed and hopefully better decisions.
Right now, we've got the Middle East conflict, tariffs, and oil prices all moving at once. Which one is hitting food prices hardest, and is that the one getting the most attention?
Yeah, so let me sort of start a little bit earlier than that, and then I'll certainly touch on that. I think in terms of the work that I do as a food economist, one aspect of the research that I've done and what I focused on that I think connects to people are food prices. And that's because we come into contact with food prices much more readily than we do other prices in the economy. And it's very personal to individuals and households, because we all have to eat, and we all have to procure food. Now, food prices have been a topic that has received a lot of attention over the past 6 years, ever since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's really been impacted by a variety of factors over that period of time. And as you mentioned, much more recently, we've seen the impacts of the tariffs and trade policy, the impacts of the conflict in the Middle East, what that's doing to oil prices, the price of fertilizer. So when it comes to what we're currently looking at with respect to food prices, the story is that it's not just one thing. It's really a convergence of factors, sort of layered impacts that are really driving up the price of food. But at the current moment, the food prices are really reflecting some of the shocks from the tariffs and trade policy, as well as the beginnings of the impact of the conflict in the Middle East, which started back at the end of February. But it takes time for a lot of those shocks to make their way down the supply chain to the price that you and I pay for at the grocery store. So there's all of those shocks. But there's still the impacts of climate change, adverse weather, the impacts of increased consumer spending on food, which all add inflationary pressures to prices. So again, the real story here is that it's not just one driver. It's really this convergence of factors that are really pushing up the price of food. And I think that's one of the sort of key things that are really important to communicate to the public.
Is there anything happening with food prices right now that isn't getting enough attention?
So there's a lot of focus on food prices. The ones that I think are getting a lot of attention are beef prices. They're extremely high here in the United States, and that's a combination of supply side shocks from weather and drought, also demand. The price of tomatoes has actually gotten a lot of attention because it's sort of a perfect case study where you have the impacts of climate change on production, but also the tariffs, because we import a significant amount of tomatoes from Mexico during our off season. And then you have the price of oil that's increasing diesel prices and making it much more costly to transport these products across the country. So, in terms of what gets underreported, I think it's the complexity of the current situation, and then in particular, how uncertainty is really impacting food prices. So it's not that there's one product that's not getting a lot of attention, but I think where we're not seeing enough focus is on the impacts that uncertainty, policy uncertainty, trade uncertainty, uncertainty surrounding the geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, what that in and of itself is doing to food prices. I think that deserves a little bit more attention than what it's currently getting.
With so many factors at play, how do you decide what to leave out when explaining this to a general audience?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And a lot of this is, trying to make connections, and they're not always necessarily causal connections, because I think we have to be very clear that there's a lot that's happening, especially, with food prices. There's so many variables at play that it's almost impossible to say, the price of beef went up because of the drought only, right, that we saw back in 2022, or because of increased consumer demand, or the price of tomatoes is up because of fuel prices, just because there's so many confounders. So that's part of the story, is just trying to explain the complexity, but it has to land with the audience. And so, in terms of how I approach this, I try to just come up with one main takeaway. And sometimes it's that complexity that, okay, the story here is that it's not just one thing that's driving food prices, but really this convergence of factors. And I really try to prioritize what I like to think of as the first order effects, especially the first order effects that are very current and timely, that we are starting to see show up in the data. So for example, what's happening with oil prices because of the conflict in the Middle East is very relevant at the moment. And so the audience can really connect with that. And it's a very complex situation. So we have the price of oil that impacts the price of diesel and other refined products, but it also impacts the price of natural gas and fertilizer. And so, what I try to do is really focus on those first order effects, and in some cases, even second order effects, if they're critical to the story. So when it comes to food prices, the main pathway from the conflict to higher grocery prices is the price of diesel, because food moves on diesel. But fertilizer is also important. Although the impact of high fertilizer prices is not something that we're going to see really drive grocery prices for more months or even well into next year, I think it's important to bring it up because it is another important pathway. It may not be very immediate, but it's something that producers are feeling, and it's certainly part of the cost pressures that are impacting the agri-food system. But again, just really try to focus on those first order effects. Try to avoid using a lot of jargon. Try to make the information accessible and connect it to individuals. And this is where, certain products can really bring some of these events to life. Like, what's happening with tomatoes. It's sort of that perfect case study of all of these factors coming together. If we talk about the impacts of climate change, and what we're seeing with more intense droughts or floods, sort of extreme weather events, products like beef or coffee are sort of a good case study. But it's important to sort of frame the conversation around the complexity and how much uncertainty there is. And that's, I think, another sort of key aspect of the way that I communicate. When we look at what's happened in the past, we have a lot of good information, and we can be a little bit more accurate in how we share those numbers. But going forward, where we're in the middle of a shock or an event that's driving prices, it's important to convey that uncertainty because that is part of what's currently happening. It gives you credibility, and it's the reality of the situation, right? Things can go different directions. And I think it's sort of important to point that out to the audience.
Some people use "it's complicated" almost as a way to dodge the question. Isn't part of your job to make the complicated stuff understandable?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're bringing up a good point, right? So just saying that something is complex, you're not doing anything. I mean, everybody, things are complex, but the complexity of a situation gives you an opportunity to be able to explain what's happening and explain that complexity to an audience in a way that's relatable. And one way to do that is not just saying, okay, well, this is complex, but let's look at sort of the mechanisms behind what is happening. And there are multiple mechanisms. And I think it's worth pointing that out, that there are multiple pathways. But let's look at the ones that are sort of those first order effects, or the ones that are much more salient. And then walking people through how those work. And then, coming back to the fact that, well, there are other pathways that we have to keep in mind. So, when we're explaining complexity, you have to sort of show proof of what that complexity is. Otherwise, you're going to lose credibility. And you're not really adding anything new to the conversation. And so, in a lot of what, I talk about, it's really trying to explain the pathways and explain the mechanisms behind, well, why does the price of oil impact the price of food? And also, put some bounds around that, right? When we see the price of oil go up, it doesn't mean that it's a one-to-one increase in the price of food, and that there's a reason for that. And also looking at, the lag between when we see some of these shocks that may be affecting production or input costs on the farm, and how long it takes for that to travel down the supply chain to the consumer. So it's sort of a lot to unpack there, but you have to go beyond okay, this is complex and complicated, because you're just sort of stating the obvious.
When you're communicating this, you're basing it on data and facts, not just opinion, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's another thing, right? So this is super critical. Is a lot of the information that I'm presenting, that I'm analyzing, is rooted in data, is rooted in facts, or data or analysis of data. And this is data that's credible data. It could be government data. In some cases, it might be industry data. But I try to rely on publicly available data as much as possible. Whether it be data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's important to use data that's publicly available, that's been vetted. And that's, what drives a lot of the analysis that I do. And also just in my role here is to sort of bring that data to life and try to connect it with individuals in a way that resonates with their lived experience.
Can overly precise numbers actually create false confidence in people?
We have to understand the limits of the data. And in some cases, being overly precise can actually backfire. Now, precision, accuracy, these are different things. And they're actually quite important when it comes to sort of academic research, which is the work that I do outside of sort of the public communication. But when it comes to communicating, telling a consumer that the rate of inflation, or that the rate that beef prices are increasing is, let's see, what I'm trying to give you an accurate number, is 14.8%. That isn't doing a whole lot. Now, putting that 14.8% in the context of, look, we are looking at record high beef prices at the moment, prices we haven't seen because of X, Y, and Z. There, you're able to sort of get someone's attention. But simply saying, tomato prices are doing this or doing that, it's, and getting very precise, that doesn't do a whole lot. It actually, it backfires. And so it's really putting that data into context, and instead of relying on that one very precise statistic, putting it in relative terms, I think, can go a longer way. Now, in some cases, it's important to say, look, this is what, the current level of inflation is and how it compares to another level, but you're putting it in relative terms. By just throwing a whole bunch of numbers at people is very counterproductive, and you're going to lose your audience, and you're going to lose the message if you do that too much.
If these pressures continue for another year or so, where do you think we'll start seeing effects that aren't visible yet?
If these disruptions continue, there's just a lot of uncertainty. But I think what is important for people to keep in mind is that the longer these conflicts or the conflict goes on in the Middle East, the more of an impact we're going to see on food prices. But here's the catch. Say that this conflict were to come to a very swift conclusion today, that doesn't mean that prices are going to come down overnight. That's just not the nature of prices. And I think that's what's worth communicating, is that prices are downward sticky. Once they increase, they very rarely go down. If you look at data for the past, since the turn of the century, more than 25 years now, food prices have only decreased 2 times, and they were very short-lived periods. Now, I can't predict what prices are going to be in the fall or next year. But what I can say with confidence is that, given what we're currently seeing, we can expect these cost pressures to persist, which could very likely lead to increases in prices in the short to medium term. Now, if we can get this conflict resolved, or the quicker that we can get this addressed, the better it's going to be for consumers. But I think we also have to be very clear in what consumers can expect, because if we, there's, and this is something that I've been seeing a lot lately. We have individuals out there saying that, oh, if prices are going to come down, That's just not the nature of prices, and that if you start going off script, going off with what the data say or historical patterns, then you're going to lose confidence. People are going to lose confidence in economic data and policymakers. And this is why it's so important to provide sort of grounded information to individuals out there.
What's something you wish policymakers understood about this that they don't right now?
Yeah, so that is a tricky question, but I think it's very straightforward. There are things that we're not able to control, right? Impacts of adverse weather, if the drought hits, that's largely outside of our control. Now, we know what climate change is doing to agriculture. We have to take it seriously. There are investments that we can make, but in the short term, very little that anybody can do about a drought or a flood that takes place. So there are certain things that policymakers, stakeholders have very little control over, but then there are many others that they have a lot of control. So when it comes to trade policy, there is decades of evidence that says that tariffs are inflationary. Engaging in trade wars is not very productive. It's counterproductive to producers, to consumers. People lose in these types of situations. When it comes to geopolitical conflicts, like the war in the Middle East, there are real consequences, whether it be in the form of higher gas prices or higher diesel prices for producers. I think if I had one message to convey, is that producers, consumers, everybody's looking for a little bit more certainty when it comes to policy. We're seeing changes in trade policy and in immigration policy that impacts availability of labor, what's happening with geopolitical conflicts. That uncertainty in and of itself increases costs, is inflationary. And I think that's the one thing that policymakers really have a lot of control over. It's just providing much more certainty in the current environment for our producers to make optimal decisions, for our consumers to make the best decisions that they can. And it's something that I think can go a long way to sort of helping stabilize what we're seeing in the agri-food system.
Is there a question you wish more people asked you?
I think we need to have, and it's not necessarily a question, but more of a conversation about how to address a lot of what we're currently experiencing. So how to address the uncertainty, how to address the higher costs. A lot of it is sort of focused on this is what's happening, what's driving it, but there's a lot less discussion on potential solutions. On the importance of investing in agricultural research and development, because that's one of the best strategies that we have for tackling future challenges, from things like climate change, issues of water availability, and just sort of looking at the importance of having sound policy that's rooted in sort of good data, good theory. I think we need to have much more of those conversations, to keep policymakers accountable in terms of, how some of their actions are impacting what we're seeing in the agri-food supply chain.
Anything we didn't cover that you think matters here?
I think we covered a lot here. I mean, the main thing to keep in mind, when it comes to food prices, actually a couple things, now that they come to mind. When it comes to the current situation, but also communicating, I think it's really important, when we're talking about food prices, to look at the distributional impacts. So we all are experiencing higher prices, but they impact each and every one of us very differently. Low-income households, for example, are bearing the brunt of these price increases. That's because they spend a significantly higher share of their income on food, and these are really the households that are having to make changes, adjustments to be able to keep food on the table. And we have to look at the impacts of support through like the SNAP program and changes that are happening there that are impacting the subset of the population. So in terms of communicating, this is where it becomes important to, not just sort of look at averages, but look at, what's happening across the income spectrum, what's happening, in terms of how differences in consumers and consumer segments. And I think that's something that I think should be getting a little bit more attention, is that, we're experiencing the economy very differently depending on our own circumstances. And I think the data can say a lot about and help inform a lot of those experiences and what we can do about them.
That was another episode of CAST Pulse. We'll see you next time.